All right, hello everybody, and welcome to the LionSide Chats. We invite you to sit back, relax, check your audio, make sure you can hear and see us, and we will be getting started at exactly 12:15. Welcome to our LionSide Chats. Please make sure that you can hear us, and we will be getting started in about a minute. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Penn State Berks LionSide Chats. My name is Dawn Pfeiffer-Reitz, and I work alongside of Sonia Delacueto and Ryan Hassler and presenting the LionSide Chats with the wonderful group of folks, faculty, staff, and students that have offered to volunteer their time and present information to us. So come on in and welcome to our campus. We're so glad that you can join us today. Before we get started, we want to share with you that you should feel free to submit questions later on in our presentation through our Q&A feature. And we will not be using the raise hand feature or chat today. Once our program concludes, we will facilitate a question and answer with our two presenters today. And we are also recording our session, and we will be posting this on our LionSide Chat website in our archives, so you can share this with your friends and your family. So before any further ado here, I am excited to welcome Dr. Jill Burk and Dr. Kesha Morant Williams, my colleagues here in CAS, over to the LionSide Chats today. They're going to be talking to us about, are you smiling behind that mask? Human communication in the age of COVID-19. So Dr. Williams, Dr. Burk, feel free to now share your screens, your screen, Dr. Burk, and we look forward to hearing your conversations, and I will be back to help facilitate Q&A at the end. Good luck, ladies.
Great, thank you. Okay, so hopefully you can see our entrance slide, and as Dawn introduced us, the title of our talk is, Are You Smiling Behind That Mask? Human Communication in the Age of COVID-19. And so when Dr. Williams and I were brainstorming for this discussion, we realized that many of us are experiencing some new or different communication phenomenon that we haven't experienced before. And we're working on ways to navigate that information. And so that's where this idea came from for this chat. Also, please know that a lot of scholars are currently doing research in this area we've been finding, but since it's so brand new, we decided to give you our perspective and take in some things that we've been experiencing. And as more research develops, it will just add to our knowledge about human communication and the way that we're interacting with each other, sort of in these new and unprecedented moments. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, first we're going to just start with some basics and talk about, why do we communicate? What do we mean when we're talking about human communication? What are those characteristics of human communication? Just to give us a foundation and give us some definitions so that we're all on the same page as far as the phenomenon that we're discussing. We're going to talk a little bit about what are some verbal communication principles and what are some nonverbal communication principles. And it's important to understand the distinction between those things, because it's going to help us to understand some of the new communication challenges that we find ourselves facing. We're going to talk a little bit about communication fatigue and specifically related to communication technologies that we're using. And then lastly, we're going to talk about ways, give us sort of some tips or some ideas and ways to manage our communication. And we'd like to hear from you then at the end and some experiences that you're having, and that can add to this discussion, and we think that that could be fruitful. So without further discussion, we'll move to Dr. Williams will be leading us and talking about why we communicate.
Okay. And so, in thinking about why we communicate, there are all sorts of needs that come into play. And the first reason that we communicate as it relates to human communication is to address physical needs. Like there may be, certain questions that we have. It could even be something, directional. Like I need that information in order to function in this particular setting or framework. Some of the other reasons that we choose to communicate are relational needs. And so that's more of the, I want to be connected. I want to know that I matter. I want to feel significant. I want, to feel meaningful to someone. And so when we think about relationships, we communicate in order to build those. Another reason that we communicate links to identity needs. And when we talk about identity, it's how it helps to shape who we are, our understanding of ourselves, our self-awareness, our self-identity. And through communication, we can sort of navigate that space and figure out, this is who I am, this is what matters to me, and this is why. Our understanding as it links to why we communicate is also a spiritual need. And so when we talk about spiritual needs, for some folks that, their mind originally almost immediately goes to religion, and that might be part of it. Like your spiritual connection might be linked to a particular religious tradition, but spiritual needs can also be like someone's connection just with the world in general. It could be how you experience nature, how you experience or establish the foundations or your ways of being and understanding the world. And so we communicate then to expand upon that. And then the last reason that we often discuss when we talk about why we communicate links to instrumental needs. And our instrumental needs is when I need something specific to happen. So if we think about maybe say in the sense of illness and a person needs their medicine, the instrumental need would be communicating, can you go to the store and pick up my medicine? So the instrumental needs is fulfilling something very specific and tangible that a person needs. So in beginning to unpack then what those various needs are, there are certain characteristics that we have to think about when we talk about human communication and as we're attempting to establish a framework. And so of those various things, the first characteristic that I want to talk a little bit about today is that communication, again, has many characteristics, but that it relies on multiple channels. And so when we talk about all of those different channels, some of the things that come up, like we think about our face-to-face interaction. So we think about interpersonal communication. We think about small group communication. We think about it in, maybe more public speaking, larger settings. We can also think about it in, say, mass mediated situations. And so all of these various channels are essential because while we're talking very much about human communication, and many people associate that with face-to-face, we're learning that human communication is linked in all of these various frameworks and elements. And so some of the other things that are important to address when we talk about these many characteristics is that they pass through a perceptual filter. And so what that means is that it's influenced by the way that I see the world, the way that I understand things, the ways that my lived experiences have created my perceptions. And so it could be something as simple as tone of voice. I might be a person that if someone is aggressive in their tone, I perceive that as confrontational, whereas they might perceive that as passionate. All right, so our perceptual filters are also important. People give communication its meaning, and that is one that I think is so essential, all right? Because yes, we have the words, and so we might talk about, say, a content message, and we might talk about a relational message. And when we say the content message, that's what the words actually say. So if I am talking to someone and I ask them, hey, can you, take care of this for me? Can you, go pick up this package? and they say, okay, they do it, and they don't, and then we have a conversation about it, and I say, oh, it's okay. My content message was that it is okay, that I will, probably take care of itself. But the relational message, whereas people give communication its meaning, was probably that I was irritated, that I was annoyed, that this person didn't follow through with whatever it was that they said. So within this, it's important again to address that people give communication its meaning. With that, we also want to address that it has literal meanings and relational implications. So that example that I just gave, the literal meaning was it's okay that the person didn't take care of it. The literal meaning was that, those were the words. However, the relational implication was probably like, oh, she's a bit frustrated with me, or, oh, she feels let down, and that I did not, that the other person didn't carry through whatever that element was. We also have to consider that when we're talking about communication and its many characteristics, that it sends messages, that we send messages whether they are intentional or unintentional. And this is something that I stress in every communication setting that I'm in. Anytime that I have the opportunity to share, some of these different frameworks, I always say that we are communicating even if we are not intending to communicate. So if you're sitting in class, or if you're sitting, in this context, even if it's face-to-face or if it's virtual, and you're like, all right, you're not intending to send a message. Maybe you aren't intending to send a message to your professor that you're disengaged, but that might be the message that they are receiving. So whether it's intentional or unintentional, messages are being sent and they are being received. Communication is also governed by rules. And so the rules, we have some basic rules that, just are across communication no matter what. But they're also governed by rules depending on the communication space that you're in. So if you're thinking about communication within an academic setting, so you're thinking about in this classroom space, or when you are sharing and receiving knowledge, that there's certain rules like that. If we're in the world of Zoom or online learning, maybe you have to click the raise the hand feature, or maybe you put a message in the chat feature, or perhaps you unmute yourself and then it grabs your professor's attention, and so they recognize like, okay, yep, this person is ready to speak. You don't just sort of jump in and begin the conversation. You frame it. That most cases your professor is going to log on, or your professor is going to come into the class and they're going to begin to establish some things. So it's governed by rules. Okay. Now, when we talk about, our general framework, we talk about some of the different characteristics, it's also important for us to talk about some of the principles that are linked to verbal communication and then nonverbal communication. And so when we talk about the principles that are linked to verbal communication, we have to recognize that our messages are packaged, all right? And so that means that, that our messages are coming, that they're linked to all different elements within that process, that particular sentence or that segment or that little communication experience is framed in all sorts of other things. In addition, message meanings are in people. And so by addressing that the message meanings are in people, this sort of reaffirms or affirms some of the things that we talked about a little bit earlier, in where my lived experiences, the way that I view the world, my perceptions help give me meaning to language and meaning to the verbal messages that are displayed. So in one context, a word might mean, like if you say, so how are you doing? In one instance, it might just mean hello. Like a lot of times in our everyday interaction, say in a westernized or the United States, in this context, that just kind of means, hey, what's up? How you doing? If a stranger says that. However, others might think, no, you really want to engage with me in that moment and have a conversation about how I'm doing. So message meanings are in people. The next one is that messages are denotative and connotative. And that basically means denotative is more of the dictionary or sort of the expected normalized definition. And then connotative is more of the definition that is established based on throughout your life. So the way that you experience love determines how you define love. Okay. And so moving on then to nonverbal communication principles, I also thought it was important to add the nonverbal communication channels. And as I finish this slide and then we transition back to Dr. Burk, I think we'll have a clearer understanding as to why it was important for us to address the nonverbal principles as well as the nonverbal channels. So first, when we talk about the principles of nonverbal communication, we understand that nonverbal messages interact with verbal messages. So as I'm talking, we're hopefully engaging. Dr. Burk is giving me some head nods, she's giving me some smiles, and it's letting me know like, okay, yep, I hope that it's okay, you're on target, or let me smile at her so that I'm giving her some encouraging affirmation so that she'll keep going in that positive realm. So no matter what her intent is, we recognize that our nonverbal messages and our verbal messages are interacting with each other. Nonverbal messages also help manage impressions. So, as I stated a few minutes ago, if I log on here and we're, delivering this presentation to you all, and I'm like, oh, I'm so excited to be here. Today is an amazing day, and we really want to distribute, get this information out to you. You recognize that my nonverbal messages, at least in that case, are not managing a positive impression. Rather, if I'm smiling, if I'm interacting, if I'm moving my hands and all of those different things, I'm hopefully managing a positive impression. Nonverbal messages also help form relationships. When we talk about it, in our face-to-face settings, as well as in our online settings, we recognize that a lot of times we read people's nonverbals just as much, if not more, than we do their verbal messages. And so if you, seem removed, if you seem distant, if you seem disengaged, even if your words are saying otherwise, oftentimes people are reading those messages. And so it helps form relationships. Now, in looking at nonverbal communication as well, it also helps to structure the conversation. And so just as, you might use hand gestures, or you might use emblems, or you might use different things that add or embellish to a message, it's helping to structure that. If I am in a setting and it's sad and it's maybe a place of mourning, the odds are that I'm not going to be using nonverbal gestures that are exuberant or cheerful or happy. And so it's adding a certain structure, which then adds a certain expectation to the way that conversation is going to go. And so now that we've discussed the principles, I think that I want to just hit on a few of the channels of nonverbal communication. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I do want to look at the relevant channels as they will present in this online setting. And so the first one is eye communication. And so just that, like, how do we use eye contact? Like, are you looking at your camera, or are you looking at the person who you're talking to, or is your head down most of the time? If your head's down, is it clear that you're taking notes? Is it clear to you, or does it look like you're texting? All right. So we're thinking about, how are we using eye contact? Like, are we avoiding eye contact? Are we sort of letting our eyes smile? Are we letting our eyes talk? All of those different levels come into play. And how do we use our eyes in communication? The next one is facial communication. So our eyes are included in that as well, obviously, but our face, like, how do we manage our smile? How do we manage our facial expression? How do we manage our facial communication? And now we recognize that, sometimes it's challenging because folks go back and forth between, if you want to turn your cameras on, if you don't, all of that, and we'll get into that. But we do have to think about the significance and the importance, and what messages are we sending if we're in a position where we are able to turn our camera on and we choose not to, versus, we recognize that maybe some other things might be going on in some instances. But what does that mean if we do, and we aren't using our facial management appropriately?
Awesome.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll shift back to Dr. Burk.
All right, so Dr. Williams laid a foundation for us to understand what and define some of the things that we're going to be talking about today in this discussion when we just say the word human communication. So we learned why we communicate as human beings. We learned about some characteristics of human communication, and then she focused for us the discussion about verbal communication and nonverbal communication. And all of those things are important as we begin this discussion and reflection on some new communication challenges that we find ourselves facing during the pandemic that we may have faced before, but I don't think in the same way and the same repetitiveness that we're facing them currently. So there are a number of things that we could probably focus on, and maybe some experiences that you'll want to share with us at the end. But we chose for this discussion today to focus on two that I feel that many of us are experiencing on a very daily and repetitive basis, excuse me. So the first one is, what communication challenges are we experiencing because we are wearing masks in public settings, and maybe even in some private settings, in the sense of having a conversation with family members or other people in a face-to-face setting where we haven't worn masks before. So I think there are a number of challenges we are experiencing. One of them has to do with what Dr. Williams said. We are missing part of our face when we are wearing a mask. So we are missing many of the nonverbal signals or the nonverbal messages that we don't sometimes are even very reflexive or responsive. We might not realize that when something's funny, we smile. It's a reflexive response. But even if we are doing that in a grocery store because someone is being kind to us, we are smiling under our mask, but it's not necessarily being seen. So we are missing, a whole half of our face when we are communicating wearing masks. And we all know that. That's nothing that's really earth-shattering, but I don't necessarily think we're always reflecting on the fact that we're missing part of our face when we are communicating. So we are missing some nonverbal signals. So one of the challenges that we are experiencing are, like I said, these nonverbal cues. So we're missing our facial expressions, and we can only be communicating oftentimes via our eyes when we're wearing a mask. So we're missing the cues from our expressions that way. Another thing that we are experiencing is there is a synchronicity in the sense of a rhythm that we have when we communicate with one another. So oftentimes we work as humans to adapt to that. And so if Dr. Williams pauses, I understand that in a conversation, and I'm going to recognize that as my cue to enter the conversation, or she's looking for a response from me. But when we are wearing a mask and sometimes we can't hear very well, or someone is perhaps mumbling under that mask, we are working really hard to have a synchronous, have that synchronicity that sometimes is missing. So we can be feeling disjointed in our conversations. And I feel that masks are allowing that to happen. So that's one communication challenge we are experiencing, is the idea that we are wearing, or not the idea, is the notion that we are wearing masks and we are missing a lot of nonverbal cues. And we are also missing then even sometimes verbal cues, because the mask is muffling our verbal message because of just pure volume or enunciation that someone is saying, so on and so forth. So that's one challenge that we're experiencing. Another challenge we're experiencing is this whole use of Zoom as a communication technology. Some challenges that we might be experiencing while using Zoom is, just like Dr. Williams said, the challenge of, do we put our cameras on or do we not put our cameras on? And if we are putting our cameras on, what are we communicating through our camera as far as our nonverbal and verbal messages go, not just in ourselves, but in our spaces and our identities. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about that. And one of the things that I want to point us towards is there is a theory called a media richness theory. And media richness theory, it actually comes from some organizational communication work and some information processing work, but I think we can point to it as to why we are experiencing some of the challenges that we might be experiencing. So for example, Daft and Langle said that face-to-face communication is the most media-rich channel of communication that we have. So what that means is that we can not just hear the verbal message, but we can see the nonverbal message as well. or we can experience the nonverbal message, even if we are in a face-to-face setting through touch, like someone can reach out and touch somebody and give them a pat on the back. So we can encompass all of our communication in a face-to-face communication setting. And then they go on and talk about different communication technologies or communication channels that then decrease in media richness. So if the most rich communication we can have, according to Daft and Langle, is face-to-face communication, then when we pick up a telephone, okay, pretend you don't see me. When we pick up a telephone, you cannot see my voice, but you can hear my voice. So you can hear some of the inflection that happens in my intonation. So I'm able to communicate a verbal message and some nonverbal cues via the telephone. If I choose to email somebody, okay, that is even less media rich, because now what you're getting is just my verbal message through my words, okay? You're not getting any nonverbal cues. Now, we as humans have adapted to that because we do things like type in all caps. And when we type in all caps, we're trying to add some richness to that communication by saying, hey, I'm really angry, okay, in all caps. Or we use emojis in some of our texting messages, and they've now infiltrated into email, but we used to not have that in email before. We used to just put like a little smiley face with some parentheses and a colon to try to communicate a smile. So we've tried to take something that's less media rich and add to that media richness, okay? And now we have Zoom, and Zoom's a whole new thing because you would think that it is very media rich, which it is, but it's still not as rich as face-to-face communication, even though I can see you. And we're gonna talk a little bit about why that might be. There's also a theory called self-complexity theory that I think some of us might explain some of the ways that we are feeling. Oftentimes not oftentimes, we as human beings, we have certain roles that we function in. We function as friend, we function as significant other, we function as professional, we function as colleague. We have a role that we play perhaps with our best friend who we were 8, and that's a different role than we play with someone who we just met in a work function. One of the things that Zoom is doing and isolation is doing is it's compressing all of these things into one space. So we are entering people's homes in a way that we weren't entering them before, and we are trying to manage these roles that we're experiencing and sort of a role merging of roles. And some of us don't have dissonance with that. Some of us are a little bit more ebb and flow as far as our roles go, but others of us have some dissonance when, you know, my home and my work and my identity as professional merges with my identity as, you know, friend in all of these places. So we are experiencing some challenges with that, some of us as human beings, and the way that we communicate and navigate and shift those roles. And it's tiring, and it produces some type of communication fatigue, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. So as we experiencing these new challenges, and maybe as you're listening to me, you're thinking of some other things that you're experiencing. I feel, you know, not just me, but researchers are showing that there's a communication fatigue that is happening for many of us. And one of the reasons why this is because we are feeling an intense performative nature on our communication. So while Zoom is amazing, we are looking at ourselves constantly on this screen, and it produces this sort of performative nature of communication, which we do sometimes feel depending on who we're talking to, but it's really amplifying that. Even if I'm talking to a friend over Zoom, I'm constantly looking at my face, and I'm constantly doing sort of an analysis of that, and it's creating sort of this performative nature that might not have been there before when I was talking to a friend. So that is creating fatigue for many people in their human communication. There's also a performative nature when we're wearing masks, in the sense of, if I'm wearing my mask and I'm smiling at someone at the grocery store, but perhaps she can't see half of my face, I may be ultra smiling underneath there, and I'm trying to communicate, and I'm using a lot of energy and emblems, and I'm also using other types of nonverbal things that I might not have used before to just say, yes, I'd like the milk, please. So we're performing we're using a lot of energy towards this towards communication, to be adding both our verbal and nonverbals and trying to make them connect. We're also hyper aware. Zoom is making us hyper aware of how we look. It's making us hyper aware of, the nonverbal communication that we give, or the feedback that we are giving, or in a sense we're not giving. Maybe, like Dr. Williams said, our intent is to be engaged, but we're looking at ourselves constantly. We're like, I don't look engaged at all. Like, I need to sit up straighter. I need to pull myself back. I need to, pull up closer. And we're really hyper aware of these things when using this type of communication technology. And it's providing a hyper focus too, a hyper focus on self that we may not have had before, and a hyper focus on how am I performing in this communication setting, which can be exhausting. We oftentimes have that some of us have that in sort of professional settings, but now we're even seeing it in family settings. Like, if you Zoomed with family over a holiday, and before, when you would be sitting naturally in a face-to-face environment, now you're all on Zoom looking at each other. And you're thinking, who's gonna talk next? Is Uncle Mark gonna talk? Is Grandma gonna talk? Grandma, can you hear me? And you're all hyper focused on one another, and it's not a natural environment for us. We are not used to these patterns of human communication that we have been adapted to learning and discovering since we were born. And so now we're trying to navigate new waters, and it's tiring. There also, like I said, is this notion of synchronicity and synchrony. So we have been learning, throughout our life, how to adapt and stop to people's rhythms. When is it my turn to talk? When is it the other person's turn to talk? And if you talk to a 4-year-old, you can see they don't know this yet. They're trying to figure that out. You say, hey, hold on, please don't interrupt, wait until I'm done. And that's how a child learns, okay, there's a give and take in a communication pattern that we have. As adults, most of us have that at this point. But now we're trying to relearn that. We're trying to relearn that on Zoom. Like, when do I stop talking? Oh, it's my turn now. Oh, wait, they gave me a pause. And we're trying to look at all of these things. And it's like I said, very tiring. So if you are experiencing communication fatigue, that makes sense, okay? And researchers are starting to point towards this a little bit more as to why. And these are some reasons that Dr. Williams and I came up with as to why we might be experiencing it. So as we move to sort of come to the end of our session, and we're gonna have some time for question and answer and sharing, how do we manage our communication in this age? I would encourage us to think about ways to emphasize our nonverbal communication. So if our face is covered in a mask, how can we overemphasize our communication with our eyes, like Dr. Williams just did? Or how can we use other hand signals or gestures to try to make up for what is missing? So that would be one way, is just to be reflective and recognize that they might not be able to see my mouth smiling. So how can I smile more with my face or with my body language? Even if we're trying to be distant, how can we lean in? How can we show interest and manage our communication that way? We can work to minimize the focus on the self via Zoom. And that's really hard to do, but thinking about focusing not always on self, but other, and trying to, even though our screen is up there and we're looking at it, trying to shift it in places so that we're not hyper focused on the way that we look or the way that we're appearing, because we can then constantly get into our heads about that in ways that we don't necessarily do all the time when we're communicating face-to-face because we can't see ourselves. We can think about how we're managing ourselves. So if you're feeling cognitive dissonance about the way that your roles are integrating as student and 20-year-old, think about where you're attending class in the sense. Are you in your bed? Are you in your room? Are you in, getting ready for class like you would in a face-to-face setting if you're having Zoom? I shared with with a class that I have friends who have small children that their school is virtual right now, they're synchronous, but they wear uniforms to school. So even though they're synchronous, they're making all of the students need to put on their uniform and sit at a table or desk to attend school, because it still then goes to managing their self as student, thinking about what is my role in front of this computer. Oh, I'm learning right now. So I still need to put on my uniform and get prepped for the learning that's going to happen. So thinking about how, even if you're in your home office, how is that different when your family is there or when your friends are there versus when you are in a working type environment? It's also important to take breaks. Even when your aunts and uncles want to Zoom with you, you might need a break from Zoom, and think about using other communication channels. So we can talk on the phone, and even though it's a bit less media rich, it's a still media rich environment. So instead of being hyper focused on what we look like in ourselves, talking on the phone provides perhaps the type of communication that you need to be having. So thinking about, what is my, and this leads into my next one, what is the appropriate communication technology to use for the situation and for the messaging? So maybe Zoom is the appropriate communication technology to use for the situation and messaging, but maybe it's not. Maybe a telephone call works, maybe a text works, maybe an email works. But trying to really manage the different technologies we have to use for the best of their ability, so that if we are having communication fatigue, we're not just dropping out and saying, I'm not talking to you, but thinking about how, what we can use to have the best communication situation. So those are just some ways to manage our communication and reflect upon it. And like we said, there's probably lots of others, but these are some new experiences that we're thinking through. And we just wanted to bring it to the group and have you all reflect and recognize some new challenges that we're experiencing within our human communication, something that we don't necessarily always reflect upon. So we'll bring it up to the group now, or Dr. Williams might want to share, or Sonia might want to share. What communication challenges are you experiencing? Do you find yourselves communicating differently with others? Are you using technologies in new ways? Are you maybe not using technology like you did in the past because you're tired? So, you're sort of dropping out of that. And are you communicating differently with family or friends? And if anyone would like to share, feel free, or if you have questions, this is the time. We have like about 10 minutes to do that. Or more, we might have a little bit more time, sorry. I'll let Sonia and Dawn navigate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to thank you so much, because I was like, oh, there's a name for this. Oh, there's a theory for this. Oh my gosh. And then I was like, I need to sign up for a communications class with my family members. So thank you so much, both of you, Dr. Morant Williams and Dr. Burk, for sharing your information today. It looks like we have somebody's raising their hand. If you can go ahead and just add your question to the Q&A feature, that would be phenomenal. I did want to share with you, I had an experience at the grocery store with a grocery shopping cart showdown, and it was like the most awkward and uncomfortable thing ever. And I kind of forced myself to laugh and giggle and say, oh, I'm so sorry. And I moved to the side because we didn't know which way the other person was going. So there was definitely aspects of the experience that were, definitely new, that we've all been kind of navigating throughout this process. We're still waiting for some answers or comments to come in to the chat. So we'll give our audience another minute to do that.
while we're waiting, I think one of the things that stands out to me when we talk about these different changes and experiences is when it does come to family and friends. Like I'm sort of torn. Like there are some instances where I love the idea of using Zoom because I come from a pretty large family and they're scattered all over the place, and we seem to purposefully connect in ways that we didn't do prior to the pandemic. Like I didn't talk to all of my family members that live in other states. It just was if we happened to interact, we did. Whereas now there's like a weekly family Zoom session that I don't necessarily get on every week, but I do appreciate that it exists. And so you can have very young family members up to, some older family members who are still like, I'm clicking the button and, those, whereas there are others other more senior family members who are very well versed in like training each other. So I do appreciate like some of the benefit in the sense that we're able to have some relational interactions that I think we just sort of took for granted or we were dismissive of prior to this situation.
I think that's all that's really important, and I want to encourage all of our participants to go ahead and submit some of their feedback or their communication changing experiences in our Q&A, and it looks like, Sonia, we have something.
We do. Not a question, but an answer about using technology. I've rediscovered snail mail. It is lovely to get mail that is personal and neither political nor a bill. I agree with that. I have fun choosing a card with a special cover picture. Writing makes me in control of what I tell, reflect on what I have experienced, and it is a keepsake for the future. Thank you very much for that comment.
And as a reminder, we're not using the raise hand feature, so please go ahead and submit your questions in the Q&A pod, please.
Or your comments. We'll also accept those as well.
And I was going to say, and we oftentimes don't think of snail mail as a communication channel, but it is. So to go back to thinking about, what is my message and what communication channel is appropriate for my message and my situation, and choosing, snail mail versus other types of communication technologies might really work well for that situation. So thinking about, making those choices intentional is important, I think.
Absolutely. And it sounds like that's a tangible item. I know that's what I like to, I had a birthday recently and I love to pick out a thank you note and put something like really meaningful in there, because right now we can't even touch each other right, safely. So giving, sending a little piece of yourself almost through the mail, that was a really, that was a nice comment. Thank you.
While we're waiting for some others, one of the comments, I forget if it was Dr. Burk or Dr. Williams, made the becoming an ultra smiler with your mascot. I so see myself doing that in all of my exchanges in the grocery store, in my classroom, and I feel like I'm working, as in the classroom, I just feel like I'm working so much harder because so much of what I do is here. And if you're only getting part of it, it's, we're I guess people are missing out, or maybe my students are like, oh good, I only have to see part of Dawn. I don't know, but I feel like they're missing out. So please feel free to share your questions and or your comments or your different communication experiences in the Q&A.
Something else I think that comes out when we think about masks, and again, I keep trying to look at, is I think that we're pretty clear on what some of our challenges are. But I feel like wearing the mask, there are times that I look at people more and that I actually feel more seen in certain settings and situations of where, because as we said, if all we have is this, I have to look you in the eye. You have to look me in the eye in order for us to, even if it is just in the grocery store. And so there are times where there is sort of a level of discomfort because you almost feel more intimately connected with that person for that moment. Because in the past, you probably wouldn't have done that. You would have just been like, oh, I'm sorry, and just turned your cart and, went your own way. So I think that's important as well.
Yes, it's really changing that interactive communication culture that we have going on with people that maybe we've never seen before in our lives. So there's actually a comment that just came in from one of our guests working in long-term care. And it has been very interesting to see how elders have adapted in their communication, was the comment from our guest.
And even in being able to visit folks, say in medical facilities, like when the person mentioned working in long-term care, I know there are a number of folks who, are really struggling with not being able to go in and have that face-to-face interactions with their loved ones, but they have been able to do that, like where nursing homes or hospitals or different things are setting up video chat options. So I had, a person who I'm thinking of where her grandmother is in a nursing home facility, and they were able to do this. So where someone, who worked there set it up so that their grandmother was able to interact and engage with them. So while it isn't as rich as them physically being there, I do think that it's something very interesting for us to continue to watch how things are going to grow and develop in that area.
I think it's interesting. I think Dr. Williams mentioned about our older relatives kind of saying, I'm pushing the button, it's still not working. How many of us have become tech support for relatives that may not be as technical as we are, and what that does to our communication?
Another comment just came in and mentioning that the biggest communication difficulty is with all of the communication that has been coming from CMS, the Department of Health, et cetera. It's been overwhelming. Reading it all and then trying to communicate whatever those messages are with other people. That was our comment.
Sure, and that could be a whole other 4 chats to talk about crisis communication and messaging and that type of thing. I agree. Thank you.
Okay, we have a couple, they're inquiring as to if you have any suggestions to help facilitate, I'd imagine, those communications or deciphering information.
The information coming in from like CNN and all of those sorts of things.
I believe that's what they're looking for.
Yeah. No, as Dr. Burk mentioned, I think that could take a number of other presentations, but I do think that it's important for us to, just as we would say in any setting, to try to look at the initial source. Sometimes we encourage people to look at multiple news outlets, and to see how, what is that kernel that stays the same across all of those various outlets. So yes, it may be packaged differently. It might have a particular leaning, depending on which outlet you're watching, but there are certain elements that are the same. I'm in a number of settings of where people have very, very different viewpoints on all of the different things that are going on. And that's where I consistently try to find my center. I try to go back to, okay, this news outlet says this news outlet says this news outlet says this. Sometimes, though, it can lead to, you being overwhelmed and you feeling fatigued because there's so much information there. But for myself, that's more anecdotal. That's sort of the approach that I take, is I try to look across a variety of outlets and see what is that kernel that is sort of the same or foundational across the board.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Williams. That yeah, it's deciphering a little piece from here, a little piece from here, and then put it all together and try to make it make sense. We have another comment. It says, I like what you were saying, Dr. Williams. I find I have amassed a collection of masks that I wear like I would an accessory. Plain for doctor's appointments, floral for grocery shopping, college colors for other times. The bigger shock to me is giving masks as a gift. My neighbor gave all of her neighbors an Easter gift of masks.
Excellent. So that's a really nice point, because artifacts are also a type of nonverbal communication. So a mask is an artifact. And the way that our space, what's in our space are artifacts, they're things. So thinking about your verbal communication and your mask as part of your nonverbal communication. So what impression are you communicating by making a choice of what mask you're wearing when? So that is a type of nonverbal communication as well. So thinking about how am I managing that, and how am I communicating via all of these communication channels.
And this is a really good segue into our next question. How might the communication issues of masks be related to the aggressive episodes we are seeing in service context? So I'd imagine restaurants or in any other area of the service industry is what the audience member is referring to.
repeat that one more time?
Absolutely. How might the communication issues of masks be related to the aggressive episodes we are seeing in service contexts?
So in like people's resistance to masks, like I don't want to make any assumption of what the person is saying. So like the conversations related to masks and then how we're having more outbreaks in certain settings.
If our audience member would be so kind as to clarify.
I think that might be where they're headed, but I don't want to.
Yes, exclamation
Okay,
point.
I was
Yes.
going to say, I don't want to make the assumption. Again, I'm in a number of different settings, and as Dr. Burks said, you all could take us down all sorts of different directions. But I think that there definitely is some linkage to that. I'm teaching a health comm course this semester, and we've talked some about COVID-19. We talked some about public health messaging. We talked about individual messaging of what some of the resistance is, like, you know, why people are giving pushback in some areas, and maybe more of a need from the beginning for some of the public health messaging that we see now about masks, that we needed some of that very early on to sort of, and so now I'm getting ready to share my opinion, to kind of minimize this very individual, this is how I feel about it as a person who has the choice for my individual health, rather than how could we craft a message for public health across the board. And so I think that we're talking about crisis communication, we're talking about risk communication. And so by no means am I saying anything negative about folks, but I think that we're seeing the nature of it. We're seeing the nature of people at least attempting to do what they perceive to be the best that they can do with what information they have at that time. But because it had the opportunity to create so many narratives, I think that it then did impact all of these other outlets of where, you know, you might see folks who wear the mask long enough to get into a space and then it's removed, or it isn't worn. I saw an ad that says, this is how you wear a mask properly, not this, not that, like all of those different images that are coming out now. And I think that there was a disconnect for quite a long period of time. And so that could be why some of this is still so very problematic.
And I'm going to add, I think I'm unmuted. I'm going to add, so Dr. Williams was talking sort of at a macro level about crisis communication and messaging. And I'll take the question maybe on a micro level and flip it in the sense of, I think that oftentimes when people have uncertainty, they choose a number of different emotional paths to go down. So wearing a mask is different and uncertain for some people. And because they're also not seeing maybe all of the nonverbal communication and the relationship it has with the verbal communication, they feel uncertain and unsure about the communication that they're having with others. And if I can't see that person's entire face, maybe I'm not really, some of us are more adept at understanding and picking up nonverbal cues than others. So perhaps then I'm not seeing it all and I'm worried, I'm scared, I'm uncertain. And some people go towards a path of aggression towards that versus, you know, the anger is their first response sometimes. And so perhaps, you know, on a micro level, maybe there's aggression related, not to, to all of those things, because it's a different experience. I think if you talk to some students who are in a face-to-face setting, like elementary school students, a lot of people were worried about them wearing masks, and a lot of them are doing fabulous. If you talk to elementary school teachers, they've adapted. It was uncertain, but they're not as sort of set in their ways sometimes as people who are older are, and they're like, oh, I have to wear this now. Okay, I'll figure it out. And they're working on a path. So, you know, to doing that. So maybe this is me just hypothesizing on a micro level, the uncertainty of not being able to see someone's entire face and being able to understand you know, the nonverbal messaging can lead to aggression and fear. And fear and aggression, they're different, but sometimes can be equated. There's also some sort of power struggles going on and related to these things. And, you know, who's wearing a mask and why. If I'm at a restaurant and I sit down and I take my mask off, but the server's still wearing their mask, like there's a lot to unpack here. And this could be a whole other communication discussion too. But what does that mean? Like, how am I viewing the other? How are they viewing me? I'm allowed to take off my mask, but you're not. There's a lot of things happening, a lot of nuances to this conversation.
I do have a question, if I may, ladies. Something that I was thinking about a few minutes ago. So the concept of masks and Zoom and its impact on nonverbals, do you see that this is going to become an opportunity for people to study this and to start picking out some best practices moving forward? Should we have to consider teaching this way and interacting this way moving forward? Do you see that as being something that will mushroom, perhaps?
For sure. I definitely see. I mean, easy answer, yes. Like these areas are ripe for research.
Absolutely. Just to piggyback, yes, I absolutely think this is the direction that we're headed, because hopefully, even when this is under whatever we deem as control, it still has changed the way that we will operate. And so, yes, absolutely. I think it will be a very significant area of research.
And just to share, one of our closing remarks from an audience member said that that's an interesting point. For some, a mask is a way to cope with uncertainty, and for others, it adds to it, to your last speaking point. So thank you both. And thank you for our participation from our audience today. This has been really great to hear what your experiences have been and kind of enrich and engage with our content experts here.
I have another question, if I may, actually. That's why I love the LionSide chats. I get to have all my questions answered. So I have a personal relationship with our two presenters today, and I know that we've had opportunities to engage differently with technology in our classroom spaces over the last 6 or so months. Can you talk a little bit about how the concept of the mask and the Zoom, how that has, I know that it's positively and negatively impacted all of us. So just maybe some of your favorite moments from it. I think that would be an interesting thing. If I can put you on the spot.
So some of my favorite moments, I think, in using Zoom and different things in the classroom space is actually one of the things I was thinking about it when Dr. Burk was talking about one of the theories she mentioned. See, I was scribbling down notes as you were talking as well. And when you were talking about sort of the blending of these identities and where some people can kind of just be okay with it and others are like, I'd prefer to have it more in boxes. As with most things, I find myself somewhere in the middle. And so I think some of the best experiences come from when I am using personal life examples, like to support the content. Like I teach interpersonal, I teach a lot of relational classes, so it makes sense. And there have been a few times of where, like, say, my kids might enter and it's like problematic and challenging, and I feel myself like, oh, but I've used it sort of in reverse so far this semester, and towards the end of when I was teaching the summer class, and sort of build it into the content. So it felt like by the end of my summer class, even though my kids didn't do it too much, like I almost trained them as when it was acceptable as well. At the beginning of the class, they would sort of say, hi, mommy, students, and then they would leave and go do what they needed to do. And at the end, sometimes they might say bye, like, or they would take turns, or whichever one, bye, mommy, students. And so it gave us sort of this framework of where they felt like, yep, mommy allowed me to be a part. Now I can go and let her do her job. And then it also let my students, because I would say to them, like, if some of you aren't turning on your camera because somebody's walking around in the background or somebody, is checking the mail. And I said, look at me, like my kids pop in from time to time. And I appreciate it because the content was still good. The students still were participating. They still were engaged, but it felt like it reduced a certain level of stress because the summer classes, they were high school students who were transitioning in. So yes, they may have finished up their senior year partially online, but this was their first round as Penn State students in this space. And to sort of be able to reduce some of that anxiety and frustration and still see them thrive, I found that to be rewarding, I think, for myself and hopefully for them as well.
I appreciate that. And I try to use that in my in-person classes, that concept of pulling the personal into it. And I do find value in it in the online as well. Thank you for sharing. Sonia?
I think we're all good. It looks like all of our questions have been answered and the comments have been well received. Thank you so much to Dr. Kesha Morant Williams and Dr. Jill Burk for joining us today. And we are going to be expecting you to join us for our upcoming LionSide Chats. And Dawn's going to speak a little bit more to that now.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you to both of our wonderful presenters today, and for those of you that were able to provide us with some questions and some feedback about, are you smiling behind that mask, human communication in the age of COVID. I know I learned some very interesting information, and I also was really excited about the newness of the research possibilities. So I'm looking forward to following up with that. So, and a special thank you to all of you for joining us on our LionSide Chat today. As you click out of our webinar, you'll receive access to a survey, and we greatly appreciate you taking the time to provide some information for future ideas for chats, and also your comments about today's stuff as well. You're encouraged to reach out to us via email or check us out on our website. And as we're always adding new chats, and speaking of chats, our next chat will be a celebration of Constitution Day, which will be taking place on Thursday evening this week at 7 p.m. at the same LionSide Chat site. So please be sure to come back and meet with another faculty, staff, student, or even someone from the community to join us in our LionSide Chat sessions. And we hope that you stay safe, Berks and beyond. And signing off until next time, this has been Penn State Berks LionSide Chats.
Thank you. Thank you guys for coming.
Thanks, ladies.
Thank you.